Punk Revolution now. Today I'm going to be talking to you about indie music. Indie, okay, indie has a very fascinating, very interesting history behind it. Lots of people don't understand it. They don't really know what indie means. In 2020, the truth is indie doesn't really freaking mean anything because there are plenty of indie bands, indie rock bands, releasing their records through some of the biggest freaking record labels in the freaking world, okay? Nothing independent about it. So what happened? When did indie go from one of the most creative, ambitious genres of all time to something that's nothing independent about it, and the term basically means nothing besides, just bands trying to look kind of, hipster or whatever. Well, I'm going to tell you that history, what happened to indie rock. I'm going to tell you it all. Let's go back to the origins of indie. So indie rock originated in the late 70s and early 80s, and all indie meant was independent of a major record label. That's all it meant, okay? Which might sound kind of like not a big deal because there's just so many albums out now through all sorts of little record labels. Well, the truth is, back in the late 70s and early 80s, this was actually a really big deal. Very impressive, because bands that sound kind of artsy-fartsy like a typical indie band, like the Velvet Underground and the Ramones and the Doors, they were releasing their record through major record labels. That's just how you had to do it back then, okay? So we don't consider those bands indie, even if they sound kind of artsy-fartsy indie, okay? But in the late 70s and early 80s, the infrastructure was finally there for bands to finally do it themselves. They put the whole operation themselves. They had to figure out, where are we gonna record? We gotta save up the money ourselves to do that. How are we gonna press these records? We gotta save up the money ourselves to freaking press these records. Very expensive operation. We had to figure out all these freaking record stores all across the country. We gotta get our freaking records to them, and fingers crossed they send our money back to us. We had to figure out, what magazines and music critics are gonna write about us because they're interested in indie bands. We gotta figure out how are we gonna tour, what freaking venues across the country are gonna let an indie band perform, okay? Indie was not even a thing then, okay? So it's just a mind-blowing, very impressive thing that happened. Indie music coming together is so freaking impressive. In my opinion, indie, at least originally back in the origins in the early 80s, was pretty much synonymous with a very high work ethic, okay? Do it yourself, okay? And think about the bands that were, the kind of the first indie bands to do this, okay? There was Buzzcocks, Minor Threat, Black Flag, Minutemen, Husker Du, Mission of Burma, okay? All of these bands, you can really just tell in their music they were very, very high work ethic, really dedicated to their craft. You know what I mean? Like, not only are they working their day job flipping burgers, but they're going home and fucking owning a freaking record label themselves and releasing this really complex music that has freaking Minutemen released like a freaking quadruple album, and so did Husker Du. That is a freaking intense work ethic. So it's no surprise when their music is really damn good, okay? Because they're ambitious, they are dedicated to their freaking craft. Okay? And there's also another thing I want to point out. Let me just kind of list some of those original indie bands for you, okay? Minor Threat, Black Flag, Minutemen, Buzzcocks, Mission of Burma, Husker Du. What do all those bands have in common? They are all punk bands, okay? Not only is indie originally, associated with a really intense work ethic, it's also kind of, just kind of really entwined with punk music, okay? And it's no surprise why that is the case, because if you're interested in making, fun little pop new wave stuff, then you go try to get your ass to a record label. But if you're interested in giving this finger to society and saying, screw the system, I'm gonna go do it my own, I'm gonna make music for the sake of art rather than the sake of freaking being a pop star, it's no surprise people with that kind of mindset would be interested in making punk music. So indie is not only really a creative, ambitious genre with a really intense work ethic, it's also very, very punk. Punk and indie, their origins are very intertwined, which is why bands like The Doors and the Velvet Underground and the Ramones sound very indie, because those are some of the first, some of the biggest influences on the genre of punk, okay? So when punk reaches the 80s, that's where we see the punk become indie, okay? So that's pretty cool. So in the 90s, something very interesting happened, okay? Bands like Nirvana and REM, bands with indie roots, okay? REM being a band that actually originated from the indie post-punk scene in the early 80s, and Nirvana, you can look at freaking Kurt Cobain's top albums of all time, okay? Lots of indie music on there. You can tell Kurt Cobain is an indie musician at heart. All of a sudden, these bands are becoming some of the, most popular bands in the freaking world, okay? This is why people are so, Nirvana is just such a huge deal to so many people. It's symbolic. It's indie rock they freaking made it. These bands like, you know, Minutemen and Black Flag, they freaking had a massive impact on music that changed the world forever. They set the roots, the foundation that allowed bands like REM and Nirvana to fucking just go massive. And then you think of other huge bands from the freaking 90s like Radiohead and My Bloody Valentine and Smashing Pumpkins, okay? Huge influence from indie music from the 80s, okay? So indie music in the 90s, all of a sudden, indie pretty much becomes completely independent with the term of independence, because a lot of these big bands are releasing records through major record labels. Now indie music was coming out through major record labels, and the term indie now encapsulated more of a sound that originated with those original indie bands more than a actual having anything to do with record labels. So in 2020, what does indie look like? What does indie mean? Well, we already know it has nothing to do with being independent from a major record label. We already saw that in the in the 90s when bands were releasing indie music through major record labels. But at least in the 90s, these bands that were getting massive radio play and stuff, their roots were in the early 80s indie scene, both in terms of the sound and the creativity and the work ethic and the ambition, okay? But, you know, fast forward 2020, what do you see? What do you think of when you think of indie? Well, let's freaking Google image it. You see a bunch of trendy images that are all like, you know, like look like a marketing team got together and graphic designed them so they look all trendy and cool, so you can click on them and listen to these radio hits on the Spotify playlist that's gonna get a lot of plays, and it has absolutely freaking nothing to do with the freaking indie music of its origins. It's just completely diluted, has nothing to do with the work ethic you find in the early 80s, has nothing to do with punk, okay? That's the key, okay? And that's the freaking key. Indie music is just completely detached from its fundamentally punk roots. Look, Google image it. Do any of those images look remotely punk, okay? It's just sad. They appropriated the punk image and they just like freaking put flowers all over it, and now you're gonna buy it at the freaking commercial store, okay? That's the modern indie, okay? And that's why you go to a shopping mall and you hear Claro playing indie music when you're trying to buy a freaking pair of shoes. And that's why, that's the secret. And that's why indie's bad now, when it used to be good because it's detached. We need to have a punk revolution, folks. This is why I say we need to have a punk revolution. We need to get the indie to tap back in its punk roots so people have a drive and ambition and creativity because they want to make fucking music that's going to change the world. Okay, at least even Neutral Milk Hotel from the 90s. Okay, that was even a band that was very inspired by punk, okay? Jeff Mangum, the singer of Neutral Milk Hotel, said his favorite band is fucking Minutemen. That's his biggest influence, which is one of the early 80s punk music is all connected. And now they're just freaking releasing, now indie bands are just releasing garbage because they want to fucking be like Arcade Fire and have posters of them, and they want to look rich, and they just want to be fucking idiots. And it has nothing to do with being independent. It has nothing to do with being punk. It has nothing to do with being creative. It has nothing to do with having a work ethic. Indie is all about playing in the system now and being trendy. Indie has been appropriated. We need to take it back. We need to have a fucking punk revolution now. We need to save indie music. We need to bring punk back into the indie music. We need to save it. We're gonna have a punk revolution now. Music's gonna be good again. We're gonna middle finger to the fucking system. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you for watching Punk Revolution Now.